A man knows when something's off. It's in the way she moves, the way she talks, the way she won't meet your eye when you walk in the room. Scarlett thought she was subtle. She wasn't. I've watched men lie for a living. Drunks at bars trying to talk their way out of a fight. Low-level crooks spinning stories when their hands were still dirty. She was an amateur. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, letting the burn settle in my chest as I stood by the kitchen window. The backyard was empty, the swing set untouched since the kids had grown, the porch light flickering from a bulb I kept meaning to change. Scarlett was late. Again. The studio ran classes until 7, not 10. And yoga didn't make you smell like another man's cologne. I heard the front door open, soft like she was hoping I wouldn't notice. She set her bag down carefully. No heavy thud, just a quiet placement like she'd rehearsed it. I stayed where I was, let her make the next move. "You're still up," she said, her voice too light. I turned, glass in hand. "You're late." Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. Class ran long. I let the silence sit between us. Just looked at her. She shifted, brushing her hair back, a nervous habit she hadn't had when we first met. She used to be sharp, practical, direct. Now, it was all soft words and vague answers. Searching for meaning, she called it. I called it something else. I drained the rest of my glass and set it down slow. "Yeah." She nodded too quickly. "Yeah. We had a discussion after class. About, deeper fulfillment." I studied her. The way she wouldn't quite meet my eyes, the way she stood like she was bracing for something. I could have asked the questions outright. Who is he? How long? What do you tell yourself to sleep at night? But there was no point. I already knew. Instead, I nodded. Sounds real deep. She hesitated, waiting for something. A fight, maybe. An accusation. But I wasn't giving her that. She finally let out a breath, half relieved, and grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge. "I'm gonna shower." I watched her go, then looked back at the glass in my hand. Set it down, steady. I wasn't some kid, some hot-headed fool who let his anger do the thinking. I was a man who knew how to wait. The next day, I stopped at Ray's gas station like I always did. He was outside, wiping down the pumps, his uniform stained with oil and sweat. Ray had been running the place for 20 years, knew every regular, every car that rolled through town more than once. "Elliot," he greeted, tossing his rag over his shoulder. "The usual?" "Yeah," I said, stepping inside for a coffee. When I came back out, he was leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "Saw your wife the other day," he said, casual. I stirred my coffee. "That right?" "Yeah." He scratched his chin. "Don't mean nothing. Just noticed she was here." "With some guy?" "Tall fella, real put together. Suit type. Didn't look like he belonged out this way." I let the words settle, let the pieces fit together in my head. Ray exhaled through his nose. "Look, man, I ain't trying to stir trouble. Just thought you should know." I clapped him on the shoulder, firm. "You did good." He nodded once, understanding in the way men like us did. No extra words, no hand-wringing. Just facts. That night, I followed her. Not because I needed proof, I already had it, but because I wanted to see him. Scarlett's car pulled into the parking lot of the yoga studio in the upscale part of town, the kind of place where people talked about energy and intentions instead of just getting things done. I parked across the street, leaned back, waited. She wasn't inside 5 minutes before he arrived. Tall, polished, the kind of man who looked like he'd never had to throw a punch in his life. He stepped out of a sleek black Audi, checked his reflection in the window, adjusted his cuffs. I had a feeling his handshake was weak. They met at the door, and when he leaned in to speak, she laughed. Not the forced kind she gave me these days, but a real one. The kind she used to have before she got tired of being married to a man who didn't speak in riddles and metaphors. My jaw tightened, but my hand stayed loose on the wheel. There was nothing to be angry about. She'd made her choice. Now it was my turn. I didn't follow them inside. Didn't need to. I already knew the end of this story. I started my truck and pulled away, heading home, the plan already forming in my mind. I didn't get mad. I got even. I parked in my usual spot at Hugo Chandler's office, a hole-in-the-wall joint tucked between a bail bonds place and a pawn shop on the east side of town. The kind of place where people came to get information they couldn't find on their own. Hugo had been a detective before he got sick of red tape and department politics. Now, he worked for himself, and for the right price, he could find out damn near anything. He looked up from his desk when I walked in, a cigarette burning in the ashtray. cheap coffee steaming next to a stack of folders. "Elliot," he greeted, leaning back in his chair. "What brings you to my fine establishment?" I sat down across from him, resting my forearms on the desk. "Need you to look into someone." Hugo picked up his cigarette, took a slow drag. "That's so? Who we talking about?" I slid a piece of paper across the desk. "Dylan Edwards." Hugo exhaled through his nose, flicked ash into a tray. "Lawyer." I nodded. He gave me a look. "What did he do?" I met his eyes. "He's fucking my wife." Hugo let out a low whistle. "Well, shit." He set his cigarette down and picked up the paper, reading it over. "Name rings a bell. Pretty boy type." "Yeah. Runs some big cases, corporate law, handles rich people's problems. Wife at home. Probably thinks he's untouchable." Hugo smirked. "Ain't nobody untouchable." He tossed the paper onto the desk. "What do you want on him? Affairs? Money problems? Dirty laundry? Everything. And fast." He nodded. "Give me a couple days. If he's got skeletons, I'll find the graves." I stood. "Appreciate it." As I walked out, Hugo called after me. "You want this done quiet?" I paused at the door. "For now." I drove back toward the house, my mind running through the pieces. Scarlett wasn't coming clean. That much was clear. Maybe she thought she was being noble by keeping it to herself. Maybe she thought she was sparing me. Either way, she'd made her bed. Now she'd have to lie in it. The next evening, she came home later than usual. I was in the garage, tightening bolts on my bike, the scent of oil and steel grounding me. She stepped in hesitantly, arms crossed over her chest. "You ate yet?" I wiped my hands with a rag. "Yeah." She shifted her weight. "I can make something." I tossed the rag onto the workbench. "Don't bother." She sighed, rubbing her forehead. "Elliot, I feel like we haven't really." "Where were you?" I cut in. She blinked. "I told you." Class ran over. I nodded slowly. "You sure about that?" Her throat bobbed. "Why are you asking me like that?" I stepped closer, keeping my voice level. "Because I know when I'm being lied to." She hesitated. For a second, I thought she might confess, that maybe some part of her still respected me enough to own up to it. But then she sighed, shaking her head. "Elliot, I'm just trying to find some peace. You don't understand." I let out a breath, keeping my hands at my sides. "No, Scarlett, I understand just fine." She looked away, and I knew she had nothing left to say. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept replaying the last few weeks, the way she'd pulled away, the way she tiptoed around the truth. I wasn't the kind of man to sit back and let things happen to me. I made things happen. 2 days later, Hugo called. "Got something for you. You free?" I was already grabbing my keys. "Be there in 10. His office smelled like burnt coffee and paper when I walked in. He tossed a folder onto the desk. "Your boy Edwards has got some problems. Spends more than he makes. Got a wife at home, but he's got a taste for extracurriculars. Your wife ain't the first. Won't be the last." I opened the folder. Photographs. Receipts. Documents. Hugo had been thorough. There was even a shot of Edwards and Scarlett outside a lakeside cabin, her hand on his chest. My jaw tensed, but I stayed calm. "He got any weaknesses?" I asked. Hugo smirked. "Plenty. You want the biggest one." He leaned forward. "His wife, Yasmin. She's got more money than God, and from what I hear, she don't like being made a fool of." I closed the folder. "Where can I find her?" Hugo grinned. "Now you're talking." Yasmin Edwards lived in a house that looked more like a fortress. Gated drive, stone walls, the kind of place where money was old and security was tight. I parked outside, checked my watch. Mid-afternoon. He wouldn't be home. Men like Edwards worked late, convincing people he was indispensable. I walked up to the gate, pressed the intercom. A clipped, professional voice answered. "Yes. Elliot Keller. Here to see Mrs. Edwards." A pause. "Is she expecting you?" "No, but she'll want to hear what I've got to say." Another pause. Then a buzz. The gate clicked open. The house was all polished stone and glass, cold in a way that meant nobody had worked for anything in a long time. A woman was already waiting at the door, arms crossed. Mid-40s, tall, blonde, sharp-eyed. The kind of woman who didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You've got 5 minutes," she said, stepping aside. I walked in, taking in the carefully curated space. Everything expensive, everything in its place. She led me to a sitting room and gestured to a chair. I stayed standing. "You know who I am," I said. She tilted her head, sizing me up. "I know my husband's been acting strange, and now a stranger is at my door." "Start talking." I handed her a photo from Hugo's file. Edwards and Scarlett outside the cabin, his hand on her back. She took it, stared for a moment, then let out a quiet breath. Not shocked. Just confirming what she already suspected. How long? She asked. Months, maybe longer. He's careful, but not careful enough. She set the photo down on the table. And what do you want from me, Mr. Keller? I want your husband to feel what it's like to have everything he's built collapse under him. Her lips pressed together, and for a second, I thought she might tell me to go to hell. Then she leaned back, tapping a manicured nail against the arm of her chair. And what's in it for me? You get to walk away first. On your terms. Before he makes you look like a fool in front of the whole city. She considered that, then stood. I'll need time. Resources. You've got both. But you don't have long. Once he sees things slipping, he'll get desperate. Her mouth curved into something close to a smile. Oh, I know exactly how desperate Dylan gets. She glanced at the photo again, then at me. I'll be in touch. I walked out knowing I just made a deal with a woman who had sharper teeth than her husband. Edwards thought he was the one in control, but he was about to learn what it felt like to be on the other side of the game. A week later, things started moving fast. Edwards showed up at the yoga studio looking tense, snapping at staff, phone glued to his ear. Scarlett called me that night, something she hadn't done in a while. I let it ring twice before picking up. Elliot, she started, voice hesitant. Scarlett. A pause. Then, something's going on with Dylan. I leaned back in my chair. Yeah. She hesitated. He's acting paranoid. Says someone's digging into his work, his personal life. That's so? I took a sip of my drink. Another pause. Elliot, did you? I cut her off. You worried about him? She exhaled sharply. I don't know what's happening. I kept my voice even. You picked him, Scarlett. Now you get to live with him. Silence. Then a quiet, I didn't mean to hurt you. I let the words sit there, hollow and meaningless. Then I hung up. By the end of the week, Edwards's life had taken a sharp turn downhill. Yasmin moved out, taking half their assets with her. The board at his firm called a meeting. His biggest client pulled out of negotiations. His credit lines were frozen, his reputation suddenly under scrutiny. And the best part? He still didn't know who was pulling the strings. Edwards was unraveling. I saw it in the way he carried himself, no longer the smooth, collected lawyer in the crisp suit, but a man who had started looking over his shoulder. His posture had stiffened, his movements less assured. His shirts were wrinkled now, his tie slightly loosened, as if his once perfect world had started squeezing too tight. I watched from a distance as he stepped out of his car outside the yoga studio, phone clutched in his hand like a lifeline. He paced before going inside, head down, talking too fast. Paranoid. Good. Inside, Scarlett sat at the front desk, pretending to sort papers but mostly watching him. Her forehead creased when he walked in, and I could tell from her stiff shoulders that things weren't all spiritual and harmonious anymore. I need to talk to you, Edwards muttered, voice low but urgent. She glanced at the receptionist before standing. Dylan, what's going on? He took her by the arm, pulling her toward the back room. Not hard, but not gently either. She followed, but not without a glance over her shoulder. Doubt. Uncertainty. She was starting to realize the man she'd chosen wasn't as in control as she'd thought. I let them have their conversation. I already knew how it would go. Edwards, panicked, would tell her someone was coming after him. That his firm was investigating him. That his wife had blindsided him. That clients were backing out. That he needed time, support, understanding. And Scarlett, caught between regret and misplaced loyalty, would try to soothe him, tell him things would be okay. But they wouldn't. The next time I saw Edwards, he looked worse. He was at the gas station, one hand gripping the edge of the counter, while Ray rang up his purchase. His fingers drummed anxiously, his knee bounced. He was sweating. Ray glanced at me as I walked in, then back at Edwards. You all right, buddy? Edwards snapped his head up. Fine. Ray exchanged a look with me but didn't push. He took the man's cash, counted out his change. Edwards grabbed his coffee, turned, and nearly ran into me. For a second, he just stared. Then, he stepped back, blinking. Keller. I nodded once. Edwards. He cleared his throat, trying to summon whatever composure he had left. Didn't expect to see you here. Been coming here for years. I gestured to his coffee. You new in town? His eyes narrowed slightly, like he was trying to figure out if I meant something more by that. He nodded once, shifting on his feet. Just needed some air. I let the silence stretch between us, just long enough for him to feel it. Then, I stepped past him to grab a bottle of water from the fridge. Behind me, I heard him exhale sharply and walk out. I paid for my drink, and Ray shook his head. Guy looks like he's about to crawl out of his own skin. I cracked the cap open. Give it a week. And it didn't even take that long. 2 days later, Edwards's world officially caved in. The firm released a statement. He was under internal review for ethical violations. Yasmin had frozen more of his assets and was moving ahead with divorce proceedings that would strip him of the comfortable life he'd built. Clients cut ties. His name was attached to legal documents hinting at shady deals. His clean, polished reputation was circling the drain. And then, for the final blow, I sent the package. It was nothing elaborate. A plain manila envelope delivered straight to his office. Inside were photos, screenshots, records. His car outside the lake house. Text messages between him and Scarlett. Credit card receipts from dinners, hotel stays, gifts. Everything he'd worked to keep under wraps, laid out in black and white. I could picture his face when he opened it. Could see the way his stomach would drop, his hands would tighten around the pages. The cold realization that someone had been playing him all along. Later that night, Scarlett called me. I let it ring. Picked up on the fourth. She didn't waste time. Dylan's losing it. I took a slow sip of my drink. That right? He thinks someone is setting him up. Her voice was edged with nerves, the same kind I'd heard when she used to try to explain herself, back when she still bothered. What do you think? I asked. She hesitated. Then, quieter, was it you? I let the silence stretch, then finally, would it matter? She exhaled, shaky. Elliot. You picked him, I said flatly. Now you get to live with it. She didn't argue. Didn't try to justify it this time. Just let the silence linger between us before hanging up. And I sat there, feeling nothing at all. Edwards disappeared for a while. Not literally, he still had to show up to work, still had meetings, still had to pretend his world wasn't falling apart. But the man who walked into that glass tower every morning wasn't the same one who had strutted around a few weeks ago. The polished confidence was gone. His suit hung looser, his hair was never quite as neat. He was running on fumes, scrambling to put out fires he didn't even understand. Word got around fast. Yasmin had lawyers on him like wolves, digging through every financial corner of his life. The firm wanted distance, his name was being scrubbed from documents, his cases reassigned. And clients? They didn't want their money tied to a man under investigation. He was drowning, and I was the one holding his head under. I saw Scarlett again at the grocery store. She was in the produce aisle, staring at a display of apples like she didn't know what the hell to do with them. She looked off, not put together like before. Hair in a loose ponytail, no makeup, wearing one of those oversized sweaters women wear when they want to disappear. She must have felt me watching, because she turned and saw me. For a second, she just stood there. Then, slowly, she walked over. Hey, she said, voice softer than usual. I grabbed a pack of coffee off the shelf, tossing it into my cart. Hey. She hesitated. You been okay? I looked at her, really looked. Her shoulders had a slight slump, like she was carrying weight she wasn't used to. A few months ago, she wouldn't have hesitated to meet my eye. Now, she flicked her gaze away too quickly. I've been fine, I said. You. A tight, humorless laugh. I don't know. She shook her head, crossing her arms. Everything's just, Dylan's a mess. He's barely talking to me. I didn't say anything. Just let her talk. She sighed. He's different now. Paranoid. He blames me. You know that? Says I was careless, that I should have been more discreet. Like this is my fault. She looked up at me then, like she was expecting something. Sympathy? Reassurance? I gave her nothing. She exhaled sharply, rubbing her forehead. I don't know what I was thinking. I tilted my head slightly. You weren't. That landed. Her jaw tightened, and for a second, I thought she might snap back, but she didn't. Instead, she just nodded, like she finally understood something she should have figured out a long time ago. When she left, she didn't say goodbye. A few days later, I got a call from Hugo. Edwards's firm just cut him loose, he said, the sound of a lighter flicking in the background. They don't want the heat. Word is, he's been burning bridges left and right, trying to salvage what he can. I leaned back in my chair. And Scarlett? Hugo chuckled. Oh, she's on her own. From what I hear, Edwards ain't taking her calls. I wasn't surprised. He'd never cared about her. Not really. She was just a distraction, something to feed his ego until it got inconvenient. And now, with his life in freefall, she was dead weight. He gonna land on his feet? I asked. Hugo exhaled smoke into the receiver. Doubt it. He's got no wife, no job, and no reputation left. If he's smart, he'll crawl into some smaller firm in another city and try to rebuild. But he'll never be what he was. I nodded to myself. Good. I didn't need to see him fall any further. He was done. And Scarlett? She was right where she put herself. I wasn't gonna pull her out. The house was too quiet. I sat on the back porch, boots propped up on the railing, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The whiskey bottle on the table was half empty, the glass next to it untouched. A month ago, Scarlett would have been inside, moving around the kitchen, humming some songs she'd picked up from one of her yoga classes. Now, the house felt hollow. Empty space where things used to be. It didn't bother me. Not the way people might expect. I'd made my peace with it long before she packed her bags. Her car was gone from the driveway. She left without a scene. No long speech, no last-ditch effort to explain herself. Just silence and a note on the counter saying she'd be staying with a friend for a while. No apology. No goodbye. Just distance. Fine by me. I had bigger things to focus on. Work was steady. More contracts coming in. More calls from people who wanted someone reliable watching their backs. People trusted me. Because when I said I'd handle something, I did. No bullshit. No excuses. Samuel showed up the next day. The kid had been hanging around the shop more lately, looking for something to do, someone to point him in the right direction. Tall, lanky, maybe 16, with a busted-up pair of sneakers and a chip on his shoulder big enough to tip him over. He leaned against the garage door, hands in his hoodie pockets. You need help today? I glanced up from the bike I was working on. That depends. You planning on actually working or just standing there? He smirked. Guess I could do something. I tossed him a wrench. Then get to it. He dropped down next to me, watching as I loosened a bolt. So, your old lady really left? I didn't look at him. Yeah. You pissed? I shrugged. Why would I be? He scoffed. I don't know, man. She cheated on you. I pulled the bolt free, setting it aside. And now she's gone. Samuel sat back on his heels. Huh. Guess that's one way to handle it. I wiped my hands on a rag. You waste too much energy being mad. You forget to move forward. He thought about that, nodding slowly. So what now? I stood, stretching out my back. Now? I keep going. That was the thing about life. It didn't stop just because someone let you down. It didn't pause for heartbreak. It didn't care if things didn't turn out the way you thought they would. You either kept moving, or you let it bury you. I wasn't the kind of man who got buried. A week later, the divorce papers came through. No drawn-out fights, no back and forth. I didn't contest anything. Didn't need to. She walked away with what she had come in with. I kept the house, the shop, my business. The things that mattered. The things I built. Scarlett tried calling once. I let it ring. She didn't try again. Edwards disappeared. No big send-off. No dramatic exit. Just packed up and left town before the firm could publicly fire him. Word was, he took a job somewhere in Houston, scraping together what was left of his reputation. Didn't matter. He was already a ghost. The kind of man people nodded at in the street but didn't respect anymore. No more prime clients, no more invitations to the right tables. Just another has-been in a cheap suit. Yasmin sent me a bottle of scotch. No note. Didn't need one. Some things go without saying. The shop was busier than ever. More contracts, more business. Security's a steady trade when you're good at it. People want to feel safe. They want to know someone is watching. I gave them that. In return, I got loyalty, steady work, and a reputation that meant something. One night, after closing up, I found Samuel still hanging around the garage. He was tossing a wrench in the air, catching it, flipping it again. You live here now? I asked, locking up. He shrugged. Better than home. I leaned against the truck, arms crossed. Your mom still working nights? Yeah. Stepdad's a prick. I nodded. I'd seen the bruises. He didn't talk about them, and I didn't ask. Wasn't my place. But I knew what it was like to grow up with a man who thought respect came from the back of his hand. I pulled my keys from my pocket and tossed them to him. He caught them, frowning. You drive? I asked. Not legally, he muttered. Good enough. I pushed off the truck. Come on. You're getting a meal that didn't come from a gas station. He hesitated, then followed. Didn't say thank you, but he didn't have to. Some things, you just do. We ended up at a bar and grill on the outskirts of town. The kind of place where the steaks were thick, the beer was cold, and nobody cared who you were as long as you paid your tab. The waitress, Laura, smirked when she saw me. Back again? She asked, setting down 2 menus. I shrugged. Got hungry. She glanced at Samuel. You adopting kids now? Strays follow me home. She snorted. Yeah, well, this one looks like he could use a damn burger. Samuel opened his mouth, probably to argue, but she was already walking away. She always like that, he muttered. Yeah. Samuel looked at me for a second, then smirked. She's kinda hot. I just shook my head and opened the menu. The food came, big plates of steak and fries. Samuel ate like he hadn't seen a real meal in days. I let him. Let the silence settle, let the world slow down for a bit. When we were done, we stepped outside. The air was cool, the kind of night that smelled like asphalt and pine, a reminder that life kept moving no matter what you lost. Samuel stuffed his hands in his pockets. So, what now? I exhaled, looking up at the sky for a second before meeting his eyes. Now? We build something better. And that was it. No looking back. No regrets. Just the road ahead.